Good evening, everyone. We're live on Inside the NBA here on TNT, and tonight we have a discussion that promises to heat up. Ernie Johnson's voice echoed through the Atlanta studio, while the warm lights created that familiar atmosphere that millions of fans knew well. It was possible to perceive that the energy was different that night. There was a subtle tension in the air, like the calm before a storm that no one could yet predict. Have you ever wondered what happens when completely opposite personalities meet in an environment where there's no way to escape? In that studio, surrounded by the characteristic smell of espresso coffee and the buzz of technicians adjusting equipment, two life philosophies were about to collide in a way that no one expected. Charles Barkley was in his usual chair, his large body occupying the space with that magnetic presence he always carried. His large hands gestured while he organized his notes, and it was impossible not to feel the intense energy radiating from him. Like a volcano that seems calm on the surface but carries boiling lava underneath. The sound of his characteristic laugh had already echoed a few times during commercials, creating a false sense of lightness. On the other side of the U-shaped table, Steph Curry was sitting with that familiar posture, relaxed but attentive. Something that touches deeply is how some people manage to radiate calm even in environments charged with expectation. Curry had this natural ability, his eyes shining with that unique mixture of confidence and humility that made him so beloved by fans. Kenneth Jones, TNT's production director, who had worked on the show for 8 years, watched the monitors with a strange feeling in his stomach. "Something's going to happen today," he murmured to Jennifer Walsh, his assistant. It was as if the very air in the studio was electrically charged, foreshadowing something that would change the dynamics of everything. "So, guys," Ernie Johnson began with his professional and welcoming tone, "today we're going to talk about leadership in modern basketball. Charles, you've always had strong opinions about what defines a true leader on the court. What do you think about the leadership style we see today?" Naturally, this leads us to the moment that would define the entire conversation. Barkley leaned slightly forward, that characteristic smile forming on his face. It wasn't a malicious smile, not yet. But there was an intensity in his eyes that suggested he was ready for something more than a casual discussion. "Look, Ernie," Barkley began, his voice carrying that authority that decades of experience provide, "true leadership is about passion. It's about fire. It's about making your teammates believe you'd give your life for them." His words came accompanied by emphatic gestures, and the sound of his deep voice filled the studio like distant thunder. What's most impressive is how an apparently innocent conversation can carry seeds of something much greater. Kenny Smith and Shaquille O'Neal exchanged quick glances. They had known Barkley for enough years to know when he was building something, like an artist preparing his canvas before creating a work that could be both beautiful and controversial. "And I have to be honest with you," Barkley continued, and now there was a subtle change in his tone that made everyone in the studio pay total attention. "When I see some players today, I wonder, where's the fire? Where's that grit that makes you want to rip your heart out of your chest to win?" Steph Curry remained calm, his fingers drumming softly on the table in a rhythm that resembled the sound of light rain against a window. How is it possible for someone to maintain such serenity when they feel they're being directly questioned? His eyes briefly met Barkley's, and in that moment, there was a silent communication that everyone in the studio perceived, but no one could completely decode. "Charles," Curry responded with his characteristically calm voice, "I believe leadership can manifest in different ways. Sometimes it's about elevating your teammates, showing confidence in them, creating an environment where everyone can shine." His words flowed like crystal water, each syllable charged with wisdom that seemed to come from a very deep place. But then something happened that no one expected. Barkley laughed. Not a happy laugh, but one of those laughs that carry skepticism, as if he had heard something he considered naive. The sound echoed through the studio, creating palpable tension, thick as morning fog. "Elevating teammates?" Barkley repeated, his voice now carrying a hint of irony that made everyone present hold their breath. "Steph, you're an incredible player. Nobody questions that. But sometimes I wonder if this education of yours isn't exactly what prevents you from being a truly intimidating leader." Christina Lopez, an ESPN journalist who had been covering the NBA for 15 years and was present as an observer, felt a chill down her spine. How many times in life do you witness the exact moment when a friendly conversation begins to transform into something much more intense? It was possible to feel as if the oxygen in the studio had become more rarefied. Curry maintained his gentle smile, but something in his eyes changed. It wasn't irritation or anger. It was as if a deeper part of his personality had been activated. "Charles, I respect your opinion." "Very much," he responded, his voice still controlled, but now carrying a subtle firmness that wasn't present before. "What would you do if someone you respected began to question not just your abilities, but the very essence of who you are?" Curry paused almost imperceptibly, as if he were consulting something internal, perhaps a silent prayer, perhaps just organizing his thoughts. It was possible to perceive that something powerful was being mobilized within him. "But I have to disagree about intimidation being the only path to effective leadership," Curry continued, and now there was a conviction in his voice that made even Barkley pay closer attention. "Sometimes, true strength lies in showing vulnerability, in admitting you don't have all the answers, in trusting in something greater than yourself. Great things happen when no one is looking, but at that moment, millions of people were watching, not knowing they were about to witness one of the most revealing discussions in the ET show's history." Barkley leaned even further forward, that smile now carrying an intensity that suggested the conversation was just beginning. "Something greater than yourself," Barkley repeated, and there was something in his voice that made everyone in the studio realize that the temperature of the discussion was about to rise several degrees. "Steph, explain something to me. How does trust in something greater win championships when you're alone at the free throw line with 2 seconds on the clock?" It was impossible not to feel that an invisible line had been crossed. What began as a discussion about leadership was transforming into something much more personal, something that touched the deepest values of both men. Tyler Brooks, a veteran camera operator, instinctively adjusted his focus, realizing he was capturing something that would be remembered for a long time. Great things happen when no one is looking, and something was about to happen that would prove that the greatest battles aren't always fought on basketball courts, but in moments when we choose who we want to be, when our faith and our values are tested publicly. But what happened next would change everything forever. The silence that followed Barkley's question about faith and free throws was so dense it seemed to have substance of its own. Have you ever wondered how it's possible to feel the exact moment when a healthy discussion transforms into something much more dangerous? In that TNT studio, it was possible to hear even the almost imperceptible buzzing of the cameras recording, like distant bees heralding a storm. Steph Curry took a deep breath, and it was possible to perceive that he was doing something that few in the studio could identify. He was praying silently. Not a long or elaborate prayer, but that kind of intimate conversation with God that people of faith have in moments when they need wisdom. His lips didn't even move, but something in his eyes revealed that he was seeking strength from a place that transcended that studio. "Charles," Curry finally responded, his voice carrying a serenity that contrasted drastically with the tension in the air. "I believe my faith gives me strength, especially in the most difficult moments. At the free throw line, I'm not alone. I carry with me the peace that comes from knowing that, regardless of the outcome, I gave my best." Barkley laughed again, but this time the sound was different, harder, more challenging. It was as if he had found a vulnerability and decided to explore it. "Peace?" he repeated, his voice carrying a tone that made even Shaquille O'Neal shift uncomfortably in his chair. "Steph, I'm going to tell you something. Michael Jordan didn't need peace. Kobe Bryant didn't need peace. They needed fury." Something that touches deeply is how some people manage to maintain their dignity even when they're being deliberately provoked. Curry didn't take the bait of the provocation. Instead, he nodded respectfully, as if he were genuinely considering Barkley's point of view, even while being attacked. "I respect those players very much," Curry said calmly, "and each one finds their strength in different places. For me, strength comes from gratitude. When I enter the court, I think about how blessed I am to be there, how I can honor the talent I received." Kenny Smith, realizing that the temperature was rising dangerously, tried to intervene. "Look, guys, I think you both have valid points here. Leadership can indeed have many faces." But Barkley cut him off with a hand gesture, clearly not interested in diplomacy at that moment. "Kenny, let me finish," Barkley said, his eyes fixed on Curry with an intensity that made the entire studio hold its breath. "Steph, you talk about gratitude, about honoring talents. That's beautiful, man. It's really beautiful. But tell me something. When Kevin Durant was breaking you guys in the finals, were you thinking about gratitude, or were you thinking about how to destroy that guy?" It was impossible not to feel that some line was being crossed. Brian Garcia, a sound technician who had worked for TNT for 12 years, instinctively adjusted the audio levels, realizing that the intensity of the voices was increasing in a way that could cause distortion. The smell of tension in the air was almost palpable, like the metallic aroma that precedes an electrical storm. Curry closed his eyes for a second. Just 1 second. But it was enough time for those who knew him well to perceive that he was making another quick prayer. How is it possible for someone to maintain such spiritual connection even under intense public pressure? "Charles, when we face difficult challenges," Curry responded, his voice still controlled, but now carrying a deeper conviction, "I pray for strength, for wisdom, and yes, for gratitude even in defeats. Because every experience, including the most painful ones, teaches us something we need to learn." "Pray for wisdom?" Barkley exploded, and now his voice echoed through the studio like thunder that finally releases all its accumulated energy. "Man, you were on the court with the best regular season team in NBA history. 73 wins, and you lost the title. You didn't need prayer at that moment. You needed attitude." What's most impressive is how Curry reacted to this direct provocation about one of the most painful moments of his career. Instead of anger or defensiveness, his eyes filled with something that seemed to be compassion. As if he could see through Barkley's aggressiveness and glimpse something deeper. Paul Martinez, an executive producer who had followed the show for decades, made a discreet signal to Ernie Johnson, suggesting that perhaps it was time for a commercial break. But Johnson, experienced enough to recognize genuinely powerful television, shook his head almost imperceptibly. Great things happen when no one is looking, but sometimes they also happen when everyone is watching. "Charles," Curry said softly, and there was something in his voice that made even Barkley pause his intensity for a moment. "I understand your perspective. I really understand. And you're right about that defeat being devastating. But you know what that experience taught me? It taught me humility in a way that no victory could teach." "Humility?" Barkley responded, and now there was something almost desperate in his voice, as if he were trying to provoke a reaction that he simply couldn't extract. "Steph, humility doesn't win championships. Fire wins championships. Hate wins championships." Shaquille O'Neal finally decided to intervene. "Chuck, man, relax a little." But Barkley was clearly determined to continue his line of attack. "No, Shaq, let me talk," Barkley continued, now pointing directly at Curry. "You want to know what my problem is with players like you, Steph? You guys are too good. You're too polite. You don't have that meanness that separates true champions from guys who are just nice." Naturally, this leads us to the moment when the entire studio realized that something fundamental had changed. Curry didn't respond immediately. Instead, he lowered his head for a few seconds, and those who knew his spiritual practices knew exactly what he was doing. He was praying for Charles Barkley. How many times in life do you witness someone praying for a person who is publicly attacking them? When Curry raised his head, there were discreet tears in his eyes, not tears of hurt or anger, but tears of the kind that arise when someone feels deep compassion for another person. "Charles," Curry said, and now his voice carried a raw emotion that made the entire studio silence completely. "I'm going to tell you something you might not want to hear. When I was a child, I watched you play. I saw your passion, your intensity, and that inspired me. You taught me that basketball should be played with heart." It was possible to perceive that Barkley didn't expect this response. For a moment, his expression softened, as if a distant memory had been activated. But then, as if he were resisting any moment of connection, his mask of aggressiveness returned even more intense. "Don't try to turn the game on me, Steph," Barkley said, his voice now carrying a coldness that made the studio's temperature seem to drop several degrees. "You can fool everyone with this nice guy persona of yours, but I know what you really are. You're a guy who never had to fight for anything in life." And it was at that moment that Barkley crossed a line that would change everything. What would you do if someone attacked not just your character, but also questioned your personal struggles and your faith in front of millions of people? Great things happen when no one is looking. But sometimes the greatest transformations happen when someone chooses to respond to hate with love, even under the most intense spotlights. No one could imagine that moment would be the turning point. The TNT studio had never experienced such a tension-charged silence. It was possible to feel as if each person present was holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. Have you ever wondered what it's like to be at the center of an emotional storm while millions of people observe each of your reactions? Steph Curry was about to find out. Charles Barkley leaned even further forward, his eyes fixed on Curry with an intensity that made even the cameras seem to tremble slightly. It was as if all the energy accumulated during years of controversial opinions was concentrating on that specific moment. The smell of adrenaline in the air was almost palpable, mixed with the cold aroma of air conditioning that tried uselessly to dissipate the emotional heat that filled every inch of the studio. "You know what really bothers me, Steph?" Barkley continued, his voice now carrying a tone that made everyone realize something much more serious was about to happen. You sit there talking about faith, about gratitude, about being blessed, but tell me something. Where was your faith when your team was losing 3-1 to Cleveland? Samuel Clark, camera director who had captured thousands of hours of sports programming, instinctively adjusted his focus. Something that touches deeply is when you witness the exact moment when a discussion stops being about basketball and becomes about something much more personal. His fingers moved automatically through the UI controls, but his eyes were fixed on the monitor, hypnotized by the raw intensity of what was unfolding. Curry took a deep breath, and it was possible to perceive that he was accessing reserves of inner strength that came from a very deep place. Charles, my faith doesn't abandon me in defeats. Actually, that's when I need it most, he responded, his voice still maintaining that serenity that seemed to defy all the negative energy being directed at him. Faith? Barkley laughed, but now there was no humor at all in that sound. It was the laughter of someone who had decided to completely demolish his opponent's defenses. Steph, let me tell you something about real faith. Real faith is when you grow up poor in Alabama, when you have to fight for every meal, when you don't have anyone praying for you because everyone's too busy trying to survive. Benjamin Lewis, veteran executive producer who had worked with all the great names in sports, felt a chill down his spine. How is it possible that a conversation about sports leadership has evolved into something so intimate and painful? He made a discreet gesture to Ernie Johnson, but Johnson was clearly torn between his professional responsibility and the recognition that he was witnessing something historically significant. You grew up in a loving family, Barkley continued, his voice now carrying decades of unprocessed pain, with parents who supported you, with opportunities most black children never had. And now you sit there talking about faith as if you've discovered something the rest of us don't know. It was impossible not to feel that a very dangerous line had been crossed. Timothy Walker, studio security, who had worked on hundreds of recordings, had never felt such intense tension. The air seemed electrically charged, as if the very atmosphere was about to rupture under the weight of uncontrolled emotions. Steph Curry closed his eyes. It wasn't a quick blink or a dramatic pause. It was a deliberate moment of spiritual connection. Those who knew his faith knew exactly what was happening. He was praying with an intensity he rarely showed in public. His lips moved almost imperceptibly, and it was possible to perceive that he was seeking not just strength, but wisdom about how to respond to so much pain, disguised as aggressiveness. Lord, it was possible to almost hear his silent prayer, help me see through his anger. Help me respond with love. Show me how to be a reflection of your heart, this moment. What's most impressive is how, even under public attack, some people manage to maintain their connection with the divine. When Curry opened his eyes, there was something different in them. Not defensiveness or anger, but a deep compassion that seemed to emanate from a place that transcended that studio. Charles, Curry said softly, and there was something in his voice that made all the hostility in the air pause for a moment. I'm sorry for the struggles you faced, and you're right about me having privileges many didn't have. But allow me to tell you something about my faith. No! Barkley exploded, his voice echoing through the studio like thunder that finally releases all its accumulated force. I don't want to hear about your faith. You know what I want to hear? I want to hear you admit that all this humility of yours, all this spirituality of yours, is just a pretty way of saying you don't have the grit necessary to be truly great. It was possible to hear, the sound of accelerated breathing throughout the studio. David Rodriguez, lighting technician who had worked on the show since its creation, had never witnessed such an intense confrontation. The studio's warm lights seemed to amplify not just visibility, but also the emotional intensity of every word spoken. Curry remained silent for several seconds, and in that silence it was possible to feel as if the entire audience was collectively holding their breath. How many times in life do you witness someone being attacked in their deepest values and choosing to respond with grace instead of retaliation? You want to know what the truth about you is, Steph? Barkley continued, and now his voice carried a cruelty that made even Shaquille O'Neal shift uncomfortably, as if he wanted to physically intervene. The truth is that you hide behind this faith of yours because you're afraid to confront the reality that maybe you're not as special as you think. Naturally, this leads us to the moment when Barkley crossed the line he shouldn't have crossed. He pointed directly at Curry, his voice now charged with an intensity that shocked the entire studio. "And you know what the most pathetic part is?" Barkley said, and now there was something in his voice that was almost desperate, as if he were trying to provoke a reaction at any cost. "You sit there talking about God and family, but when real pressure appears, when you have the game on the line, you shrink, you hide, and then you come with these pretty excuses about God's plans to justify your failure. What would you do if someone attacked not just your faith, but also questioned your courage in front of millions of people?" Steph Curry did something few expected. He smiled. Not a forced or defensive smile, but a smile that seemed to carry decades of inner peace tested in fire. Michael Thompson, veteran journalist who had covered the NBA for 25 years and was present as a special observer, felt his own eyes well up. It was impossible not to perceive that he was witnessing something that completely transcended sports. He was seeing a man choose love over hate, faith over fear, compassion over retaliation. Curry leaned slightly forward, his eyes meeting Barkley's with a serene intensity that seemed to disarm all the aggressiveness directed at him. Great things happen when no one is looking, but sometimes the greatest transformations happen when someone chooses to demonstrate true strength at the moment when the entire world is watching. "Charles," Curry said, and now his voice carried an authority that didn't come from anger or defensiveness, but from a conviction so deep it seemed to emanate from his very soul. "Let me tell you something about faith that you might not understand." And it was at that moment that the entire studio realized that something monumentally transformative was about to happen. The response that would follow wouldn't just be a defense. It would be a demonstration that true strength sometimes manifests through vulnerability, and that the greatest victory isn't defeating your opponent, but transforming them. And it was then that the truth finally came to light. Steph Curry remained silent for almost 10 complete seconds, an eternity on live television. But it wasn't a silence of hesitation or fear. It was the silence of someone who was consulting a source of wisdom much deeper than any human argument could reach. Have you ever wondered how it's possible to maintain such inner peace when the whole world seems to be falling apart around you? The entire studio seemed suspended in time. Charles Barkley, still breathing heavily after his emotional attack, watched Curry with a mixture of expectation and something that seemed almost vulnerability. It was as if, after exposing all his anger, he finally realized he had revealed much more about himself than he intended. When Curry finally spoke, his voice carried a quality that no one in the studio had heard before. It wasn't the usual calm, nor the characteristic diplomacy. It was something much deeper, as if each word was being extracted directly from his soul. "Charles," Curry began, and there were discreet tears in his eyes. Not tears of hurt, but tears of the kind that arise when someone is about to speak a truth that can change lives. "You're right about some things. I really had privileges that many didn't have. My parents gave me love, support, opportunities. And you, know what else? I'm grateful for that, every day." Something that touches deeply is how some people manage to transform attacks into bridges. Instead of defending himself, Curry was building a connection with the very wounds that Barkley had exposed. Marcus Williams, audio engineer who captured every tonal nuance, instinctively adjusted the equipment, realizing he was recording something historically significant. "But you know what my faith taught me, Charles?" Curry continued, his voice gaining strength like a river that finds its natural course. "It taught me that when someone attacks me, it's because that person is suffering. And my role isn't to attack back. It's to love even more." Barkley opened his mouth to respond, but something in Curry's genuine intensity made him pause. It was impossible not to feel that some fundamental change was happening in the dynamics of that confrontation. What began as an attack was transforming into something completely unexpected. "Charles, you want to know about my faith?" Curry asked. And now there was a passion in his voice that made the entire studio pay total attention. "My faith teaches me that God places people in our lives for a reason. And you know what one of the biggest influences in my life was? It was you." The impact of these words was immediate and visible. Barkley recoiled slightly in his chair, as if he had been physically hit by something he didn't expect. How is it possible for someone to respond to attacks with gratitude? The silence that followed was so profound that it was possible to hear the buzzing of cameras capturing every second of that transformative moment. "When I was a child," Curry continued, his voice now charged with a raw emotion that made even the technicians stop what they were doing, "I watched you play and saw someone who played with a completely open heart. You taught me that basketball should be played with passion, that it should mean something." It was possible to perceive that Barkley was fighting against something internal, as if decades of defensiveness were being confronted by a gentleness he didn't know how to process. His eyes, which moments before shone with aggressiveness, now revealed something much more vulnerable. "But you know what else you taught me, Charles?" Curry asked, and now there was a genuine smile on his face that seemed to radiate light amid the tension. "You taught me that true strength doesn't come from never falling. It comes from how you get up. And every time you fought against adversities, every time you faced prejudice, every time you refused to give up, you were teaching me about faith." Naturally, this leads us to the moment that would change everything. Curry leaned toward Barkley, his voice now carrying an intensity that transcended any discussion about basketball. "The difference is that my faith has a name," Curry said, and there was a conviction in his voice that made the studio air seem electrically charged. "I call that strength Jesus Christ. But you, Charles, you always had faith too. Faith in yourself, faith in justice, faith that your struggles were worth it. You just never called it faith." What's most impressive is how truth, when spoken with genuine love, has the power to disarm any hostility. Barkley was clearly struggling against emotions he hadn't visited in decades. His hands, which gestured aggressively minutes before, now trembled slightly as he tried to process what he was hearing. "You want to know where my faith was when we were losing 3-1, Curry asked, and now his voice carried a vulnerability that made the entire studio silence completely. My faith was whispering to me that even if we lost, I had been blessed to be in that position. But you know what my faith also told me? It told me to fight with every fiber of my being, because this talent isn't mine, it's God's, and I needed to honor it. Ashley Williams, production assistant who had worked on the show for 6 years, felt tears rolling down her face. How many times in life do you witness someone transform a moment of attack into a demonstration of love so pure that it touches even hearts that seemed closed? And when we won those 3 straight games, Curry continued, I wasn't thinking about how incredible I was. I was thinking about how God had used our hands, our hearts, our determination to do something that seemed impossible. I was thinking about how you, Charles, had inspired me to never give up. It was impossible not to perceive that something monumental was happening. Barkley, who moments before attacked relentlessly, now had tears shining in his eyes. They weren't tears of defeat or humiliation. They were tears of someone who had been touched by a gentleness he didn't know still existed in the world. Charles, Curry said softly. And now there was a tenderness in his voice that made even the cameras seem to tremble with emotion. You said I hide behind my faith. But let me tell you something. My faith doesn't hide me from anything. My faith gives me courage to be here, vulnerable in front of millions of people, and tell you that even after you attacked me, I love you like a brother. The impact of these words was devastating. Barkley lowered his head, his hands partially covering his face as he fought against emotions he hadn't visited in years. It was possible to feel as if the entire atmosphere of the studio had been transformed, as if the very air had been purified by such a genuine demonstration of love. You want to know what the truth about strength is? Curry asked, his voice now carrying an authority that came from a place much deeper than any sporting achievement. True strength is loving someone who hurts you. True strength is thanking God for people like you who challenge me to be better. True strength is recognizing that we're all fighting against something and that our mission isn't to defeat each other. It's to elevate ourselves together. Great. Things happen when no one is looking. But sometimes the greatest transformations happen when someone chooses to demonstrate that love is more powerful than any argument, that gratitude is stronger than retaliation, and that true faith manifests not in pretty words, but in how we treat those who hurt us. When Curry finished speaking, the silence in the studio was absolute. It wasn't the tense silence from before. It was the reverent silence of people who had just witnessed something sacred. Barkley slowly raised his head, and when his eyes met Curry's, there was something in them that didn't exist before. Respect, admiration, and, above all, love. Steph, Barkley began, his voice choked with emotions that decades of hardness couldn't erase. I apologize. You just taught me something I didn't know I needed to learn. And it was at that moment that everyone realized they had witnessed something much more powerful than any sporting victory. They had seen how true faith manifests, not through judgment or superiority, but through a love so genuine that it has the power to transform even the most hardened hearts. How is it possible that a response based on love and gratitude has more power than any attack? Perhaps because, deep down, we all recognize truth when it's spoken with genuine love. Perhaps because the strength that comes from true faith doesn't need to defeat anyone to prove its worth. It simply loves, and in that love, finds the most complete victory of all. The show ended that night not with debates or analyses, but with 2 men embracing. One who had learned that strength can be demonstrated through vulnerability, and another who had discovered that his own journey of struggle had always been, in its essence, a journey of faith. And perhaps that's the most powerful lesson of all. That great things happen when no one is looking, but the greatest happen when someone chooses to respond to hate with love, transforming moments of conflict into opportunities for mutual growth. Because that's how true faith works, not judging or condemning, but loving until love is the only possible answer.